He never expected it to go this far. These words echoed in the courtroom, spoken by a man whose life had spiraled into chaos. What began as a simple act quickly became one of the most shocking betrayals in recent memory. This case isn't just about crime. It's about the destruction of trust in unexpected ways. In this episode, we explore the unsettling stories of individuals who betrayed their own, soldiers who became criminals and committed horrific acts of violence. From a quiet neighborhood in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to a military base near a war zone, these stories of murder and tragedy captivated the nation, leaving many questions unanswered. In today's episode, we're not only examining the crimes but also delving into the motivations behind them. These actions shattered lives, split families, and forced perpetrators to face the consequences of their decisions. We'll walk through key moments, analyzing how these events unfolded. What drives someone to commit such violence? When betrayal comes from those you trust most, the effects are devastating. And when it's someone in uniform, sworn to protect, evil can appear in unexpected places. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? These cases show the destructive power of such betrayal, leaving lasting grief. The responsibility for allowing these events to escalate into violence is debated. Was it a system failure or a breaking point for these individuals? What could have been done differently? By the end of this video, you'll have a deeper understanding of these cases and the key moments leading to their downfall. Stay with me as we uncover the truth behind these shocking events. The military death penalty is one of the most severe sentences the armed forces can hand down. Since its inception, over 130 service members have faced this harsh fate. However, the case of Timothy B. Hennis stands out, not just for the crime he committed, but for the twists and turns that would keep him on death row for decades. His story starts in 1985 when a peaceful town in North Carolina was torn apart by violence. A respected Army sergeant would soon be at the center of a tragedy that would leave an entire family dead and lead to a haunting search for justice. It was May 7, 1985, when Timothy B. Hennis first entered the Eastburn family's life. Hennis, an Army sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg, responded to an ad placed by Catherine Eastburn, seeking a new home for her dog Dixie. What appeared to be a simple interaction would soon become part of a chilling narrative. 4 days later, on May 11th, police discovered a gruesome crime scene. Catherine Eastburn was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered, along with her 2 young daughters, Carrara and Erin. The youngest daughter, Jana, miraculously survived, but she was severely dehydrated. The home had been hastily cleaned, but traces of evidence pointed to a suspect. It didn't take long for investigators to zero in on Hennis. Witnesses reported seeing a tall man leaving the Eastburn house with a trash bag, a description that fit Hennis. More evidence came to light, and soon Hennis was identified as the prime suspect. In 1986, Hennis was arrested and charged with the murders of Catherine, Carrara, and Erin Eastburn. With no direct physical evidence connecting him to the scene, the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the jury convicted Hennis in 1986, and he was sentenced to death. Hennis's trial, one of the most publicized of its time, seemed like the end of the line for the Army sergeant. But this case was far from finished. Hennis appealed his conviction, and in 1989, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled that his trial had been prejudiced by errors, and they overturned his conviction. A retrial was ordered, and this time, the defense argued that the case lacked direct physical evidence to prove Hennis's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In 1989, after a retrial, Timothy Hennis was acquitted of all charges. He walked free, a man once convicted of murder, but now a free man. Hennis went on to serve in the military once again, rising through the ranks and retiring in 2004 as a staff sergeant. It seemed the case was closed, but the truth was still out there. In 2006, a major breakthrough occurred. With advances in DNA testing, evidence that had once been considered useless was now viable for analysis. Investigators reopened the case and found a match between the DNA found at the crime scene and Timothy B. Hennis. Though Hennis had been acquitted, the DNA evidence was undeniable. But since he had already been tried in civilian court, he could not be retried due to double jeopardy laws, unless, of course, he was tried under military jurisdiction. In 2010, 25 years after the murders, Hennis was brought back into the military justice system for a court-martial. This rare legal process allowed for a retired service member to be recalled and tried under military law. With DNA evidence now conclusively linking Hennis to the crime, he was convicted again and sentenced to death. Hennis is currently on death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. What do you think about this strange and shocking case? How does it feel knowing that justice came so many years after the original crime? If you're intrigued by this story, make sure to like this video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Dark Justice Files. We're just getting started with these unbelievable cases. Up next, we'll move into the tragic and shocking story of Hassan Karim Akbar, the soldier who turned his anger on his fellow service members during the early days of the Iraq War. His story is one of internal conflict, extreme actions, and betrayal that rocked the military to its core. Stay tuned. March 23, 2003. The world was already on edge as the United States initiated its invasion of Iraq. Tensions were high, nerves were frayed, and the military's focus was on preparing for the chaos of war. But no one could have anticipated that the first fatal attack would come from within their own ranks. Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar of the 326th Engineer Battalion had been stationed at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait, preparing for the upcoming deployment to Iraq. But something within him had snapped, and the consequences would be felt by his comrades and the military for years to come. Hassan Akbar had always been an outsider among his fellow soldiers. Described by some as distant, disgruntled, and troubled, he had a history of insubordination and paranoia. Akbar had been written up for various behavioral issues, and his peers felt that he was a man on the edge. His isolation and resentment seemed to build up over time, and he began to express a deep mistrust for the very people he was supposed to serve alongside. In private, he kept a diary in which he recorded his growing dissatisfaction. One entry, dated February 4, 2003, read, "I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible." The night of March 23, 2003, began as any other at Camp Pennsylvania. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., the base was plunged into darkness. The power had been sabotaged. Akbar had tampered with the generator. As soldiers slept unaware in their tents, Akbar quietly crept through the shadows with a duffel bag full of grenades. What followed was a brutal and calculated attack. Akbar pulled the pins on 4 fragmentation grenades and tossed them into the tents of his fellow soldiers. Then, armed with an M4 rifle, he began shooting at those who tried to escape. The chaos was immediate: explosions, gunfire, and confusion. When the dust settled, 2 soldiers had been killed: Captain Christopher S. Seifert and Major Gregory L. Stone. 14 others were injured, many of them critically. Akbar's attack was not random, it was targeted and planned. His fellow soldiers quickly overpowered him and arrested him at the scene. The investigation revealed that Akbar had been harboring deep resentment toward his fellow soldiers, and his violent outburst was fueled by a mix of paranoia, frustration, and a complete breakdown of trust. In the aftermath of the attack, investigators uncovered disturbing evidence. Akbar's diary entries painted a picture of a man who had been simmering with anger for months. His writings expressed a desire for revenge, and the details of his attack were disturbingly precise. Akbar's actions were not those of a mentally unstable individual, but rather of someone who had planned and executed a calculated attack. His defense, however, would later argue that his actions were driven by mental illness, stress, and the pressures of war. Akbar was court-martialed in 2005, facing charges of 2 counts of premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. The government's case rested on the evidence of the attack itself, as well as Akbar's diary, which directly linked him to the crime. The defense, however, argued that Akbar was mentally unstable, citing the stresses of war, sleep deprivation, and anxiety. The jury, however, did not buy the argument. and on April 21, 2005, Akbar was found guilty on all charges. Hassan Akbar became the first American soldier since the Vietnam War era to receive the death penalty for attacking his fellow troops during wartime. The sentence was automatic, and higher courts reviewed it as required by military law. Despite his legal team's efforts to appeal the sentence on various grounds, including mental health issues, the conviction was upheld. Akbar remains on death row at the U.S. disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he has spent years awaiting execution. Akbar's story is a haunting reminder of the psychological toll of war and the betrayal that can come from within. If you're finding this case as shocking as I did, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Dark Justice Files to hear more stories that explore the human side of crime and justice. The name Ronald Adrian Gray has become synonymous with terror and betrayal in the U.S. military. Between 1986 and 1987, Gray's reign of violence took the lives of at least 4 women and left many others traumatized. His story stands as one of the most brutal and disturbing in U.S. military history. A soldier stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Gray was a part of one of the most elite units, the 82nd Airborne Division, but behind his uniform was a predator whose crimes would shake both the civilian and military communities. Gray's killing spree began on April 27, 1986, with the murder of Linda Jean Coates, a 23-year-old student from Campbell University. Her body was found, and at first it seemed like an isolated incident. However, Gray's next attack would show that this wasn't an isolated tragedy, but the start of something far more disturbing. Just weeks later, Gray's second victim, Tammy Kofir Wilson, was found dead. Her body showed clear signs of violent assault and murder, but this time, authorities began to connect the dots between the murders. As time went on, more victims came forward, and the pattern of Gray's actions became clear: kidnapping, rape, and brutal killings. His third victim was Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, a young woman who was last seen with a man matching Gray's description. Her body was found shot multiple times in the woods near Fort Bragg. As investigators began piecing together the details of the case, they found a link between Gray and each of the murders. Authorities discovered a .22 caliber pistol at the scene, later traced back to Gray, and found further evidence in his belongings. Then came Marianne Lang Namioth, who was lucky to survive Gray's attack. Gray used a ruse to gain access to her barracks, where he then sexually assaulted and stabbed her. Miraculously, Namioth survived the attack and provided a detailed statement to the police that placed Gray at the scene. Her testimony would later become a critical piece of the puzzle that eventually led to Gray's capture. In January 1987, Kimberly Ann Ruggles, a 23-year-old civilian taxi driver, was found murdered after picking up Gray. Her body was discovered with multiple stab wounds and signs of sexual assault. Authorities quickly traced the evidence to Gray, including his fingerprints found inside her cab. With the evidence mounting, Gray's name was broadcasted on local news, and soon after, the net closed in on him. Namioth, who had survived his previous attack, identified him immediately, as did several other witnesses. Gray's arrest brought the full scope of his crimes into light. Investigators found DNA evidence, ballistic tests, and multiple witness testimonies that conclusively linked Gray to the murders. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Gray wasn't just a murderer. He was a calculated predator, stalking his victims and committing his crimes with chilling precision. Gray's trial was one of the most notorious in military history. In November 1987, he pleaded guilty to 22 felonies, including second-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. But his legal troubles didn't end there. Because he was an active-duty soldier, he was also subject to military law. A general court-martial was convened, and in 1988, Gray was convicted on 14 counts. These included 2 charges of premeditated murder for the killings of Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay and Kimberly Ruggles, as well as 1 charge of attempted premeditated murder. Gray was sentenced to death, and his dishonorable discharge from the military followed. His case was sent to the president for approval, which in 2008 came after 20 years of waiting. President George W. Bush signed the execution order, But Gray's execution has never been carried out. He remains the longest-serving inmate on military death row. The story of Ronald Gray is not just one of violence, it's a story of trust broken, of a soldier hiding a brutal, dark side that no one saw coming. It's a reminder of how evil can exist behind a uniform. If you're shocked by this case, hit the like button and leave your thoughts below. Do you think Gray's execution will ever happen? Let me know your opinion in the comments. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Justice Files to keep up with more true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of the world. Our next case dives into the shocking tragedy of Major Nidal Malik Hassan, a U.S. Army psychiatrist who turned his weapon on his fellow soldiers. Stay tuned for a case that questions loyalty, the breakdown of mental health, and the failure of the system to prevent a devastating tragedy. On November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas, became the site of one of the deadliest mass shootings ever to take place on a U.S. military base. Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an Army psychiatrist, turned his weapon on his fellow soldiers, leaving 13 dead and over 30 wounded. What was supposed to be a routine day of medical checks and paperwork became a tragedy that shook the U.S. Army and the entire nation. Hassan's actions raised serious questions about mental health, loyalty, and the failure of the military to recognize the signs of an impending disaster. Nidal Malik Hassan's background was that of a highly educated and well-versed military officer. A graduate of Virginia Tech and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, Hassan had been tasked with helping soldiers cope with the psychological toll of war, specifically PTSD. Despite his education and experience, Hassan's personal beliefs began to conflict with his professional duties. Over time, Hassan's views shifted dramatically, especially regarding U.S. military operations in the Middle East. His growing extremism was subtle at first, but soon became more apparent. Hassan began communicating with extremist figures overseas, and his behavior became increasingly isolated. Emails were discovered between him and radical clerics, which suggested that his anger was not only directed at the military, but also at the people he had sworn to protect. These troubling signs were not ignored, but they weren't acted upon either. The afternoon of November 5th seemed like any other. Soldiers were gathered at the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, undergoing medical checks and final preparations before deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan. At around 1:30 p.m., Hassan walked into the center armed with an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol and a .357 revolver. Hassan shouted, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," before he opened fire on a crowded room of unarmed soldiers. Chaos ensued. Soldiers ducked under tables, scrambled to escape, and windows were smashed as some attempted to flee. Hassan moved through the building, shooting anyone in sight. Within minutes, the damage was done. 13 soldiers were killed, and over 30 others were wounded, many critically. Military police responded quickly, engaging Hassan in a shootout that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was apprehended and taken into custody. The investigation into Hassan's background revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. Despite his role as a psychiatrist, Hassan's increasing isolation, radicalization, and troubling statements should have raised alarms within the military. Emails detailing his communications with extremist figures suggested a clear ideological shift, one that directly contradicted his responsibilities as a U.S. Army officer. Hassan's colleagues had noticed his growing hostility towards U.S. military policies, particularly those in the Middle East. However, no one had seriously considered the possibility that he might turn violent. The military's failure to address these warning signs would become a major point of contention in the years that followed. In 2013, Hassan stood trial for the massacre at Fort Hood. The proceedings were contentious from the start. Hassan refused to adhere to military grooming standards, citing religious obligations, and even represented himself in court. His statements during the trial shocked many, as he openly declared his allegiance to what he saw as a war between Islam and the West. He showed no remorse for his actions and made no attempt to defend his actions. On August 23, 2013, The military jury convicted Hassan on 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. Just 5 days later, he was sentenced to death. The case was sent to higher military courts for review, but due to the nature of military law, the process could take years before an execution could be carried out. The Fort Hood shooting remains one of the most traumatic events in U.S. military history. Hassan's actions not only shattered the lives of the victims and their families, but they also raised difficult questions about how the military identifies and deals with radicalized individuals within its ranks. The attack exposed significant flaws in the military's ability to screen for potential threats within its own personnel. In the years following the shooting, there were numerous calls for better mental health screening, more thorough background checks, and increased awareness of the signs of radicalization. But for the victims and their families, these discussions came too late. The Fort Hood shooting is a tragic reminder of the consequences when radicalization goes unchecked. Hassan's case raised important questions about the mental health of service members and the system that failed to prevent such an atrocity. If you find this case as disturbing as I do, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think could have been done to prevent this tragedy? And as always, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Justice Files for more true crime cases that shed light on the darkest corners of justice. In our next episode, we will uncover a case that examines the breakdown of justice from within the U.S. military. Stay tuned for more shocking stories that reveal just how far some will go when loyalty is compromised.